Welcome back, students. When we left off, the conservative aristocracy and monarchs of Europe had successfully pushed back against the liberal middle class and radical working class in the revolutions of 1848. It was a significant disruption to the concert of Europe. But those reactionary forces that had successfully put down the Spring of Nations were not going to be able to hold back that steady march of history towards democracy and more socialized states. And a whole lot of this was due to the evolution of technology throughout the 19th century. In 1802, the very first steam locomotives, or the very first train engines, were invented. And by the time we get to the 1810s, we do start to see widespread commercial production of these. By the time we get to the 1820s, we actually have passenger train services. So people are starting to move around much faster than they ever had before. Of course, this is still limited to the upper classes at this point. It's in the 1830s that modern photography really has its birth. There had been research in this going back centuries, and in the 1700s there had even been some scientists who had been able to create images that lasted just for a little bit of time. It's in the 1830s, though, that we get our very first permanent images, and it's not really going to be until the 1850s that this becomes a more widespread thing that people take part in. But think about that for a minute. Think about how accurate a photograph is compared to even a really great painting, making it possible for people to actually see what faraway places look like or what individual people look like without the idealized versions of them that are presented in paintings and drawings. Keep in mind as we go through this that all of it is changing the perspective of Europeans. Just as moving to a heliocentric model of the universe as opposed to a geocentric really blew a lot of people's minds, technology is something that actually starts to change the daily lives of Europeans, rich and poor, during the 19th century. In 1836, the revolver was invented, and it wasn't the most expensive thing. You now have plenty of people that can carry around a concealed gun. In 1837, we get the invention of the telegraph, long-distance communication. That's as big of a change to the European society as the internet was to the world in the 1990s. In 1853, we get the very first pedaled bicycles. Before that, there were bicycles that people just kind of like used their feet to push along with, kind of like a scooter that you sit on. But with the advent of pedaled bicycles, once again, these were not expensive. Lower class people could afford now to have some type of vehicle that allowed them to go long distances. No longer do the majority of Europeans get born into a village that they're never going to leave. They're getting outside information from pictures, from telegraphs, and many of them are starting to bike to cities and check things out and then come back home and tell everybody about what they have discovered. Though it's not really until the 1860s that bikes become regularly used by many Europeans. In 1859, Charles Darwin published his On the Origin of Species. He's not the very first one who started thinking about the ideas of evolution, but he is the one who provides very, very clear evidence that evolution has been taking place for millions of years, and that ultimately all life on Earth comes from the same origin, that we are not completely separate things from apes or dogs or lizards, that in many ways all forms of life are just cousins to each other. This fundamentally changes the study of biology, and it will make a huge impact on things like medicine as we move forward in time. In 1861, just in time for the American Civil War, the Gatling gun was invented, making it much easier to kill many more people a lot faster. This is the trajectory of warfare that we're going to see continue to move along this vector for the next century. It's in 1868 that the modern typewriter was invented, making it easier to produce documents much faster, and not everybody had to be trained in having excellent penmanship in order to be able to produce things that others can read. It's in 1869 that the periodic table of elements was created, or one could say discovered, radically changing chemistry, which will lead to things like nuclear energy, plastics, and many advances in medicine, including chemical treatments for mental health issues. None of that would have been possible without the periodic table of elements. It's in the 1870s that commercial production of electric generators begin. This is not for widespread use, but essentially generators that exist for individual factories. And in 1876, the telephone is invented, continuing this communications revolution that started with the telegraph and, of course, is going to end up with the internet in our current day. But you can imagine the first time people that can actually call their relatives who lived in a different state or a different country. That was something beforehand. The only communication you had was letters or possibly those little short telegraph messages. People are being drawn closer and closer together even when they weren't living together. In 1877, we get the phonograph, the beginning of actual recordings of sound. And it's in the 1880s that we get the first municipal electric plants, primarily in large cities like London and New York. But this is the beginning of cities actually having widespread electricity, where bars can now have light bulbs that can keep them open later without having to worry about having all these flames everywhere. Though it's still going to take a while for all of this to really spread. Even by the time we get to the 1930s, there's going to be large parts of the United States that don't have electricity. In 1884, the machine gun was invented, and it's 1885 that the first commercially viable car was created, incidentally by a German named Carl Benz. You might have heard of Mercedes-Benz. And we're still a good ways off here from Ford creating a car that the average person could buy. There certainly aren't any poor folks and hardly any middle-class folks who could afford to buy one of these early cars. But it is still changing society. It's in the 1880s that radio waves were first discovered, in the 1890s that we get our very first radio broadcasts, though it won't be until around 1905 or 1910 that we actually get the first commercial radio stations. And finally, in 1903, the airplane was invented. So every generation during the 19th century saw themselves living in a world very different from the generation beforehand, not just because of all these new ideologies that were spreading around, but because of these technologies that were radically transforming society. Just think about how much the internet and then smartphones have changed our experience in the modern day. Things like the telegraph or telephone or bicycles had just as much of an impact on the lives of those people in the long 19th century. And it's also worth making the connection between all these new ideas that are being articulated in the 19th century, how they're spreading so easily from one group to another because of all this new technology. And so while the revolutionaries of 1848 did not win, their ideas, along with this new tech, forced the oligarchs and the monarchs of Europe to really start changing up their game plan. They couldn't continue trying to dominate things as they had in the 16 and 1700s. Information was no longer firmly in their control. One of the ways that the aristocracy responded to all of this in the 19th century was to start creating secret police forces. Essentially, arms of the government that kept an eye on anybody that was producing new literature that might radicalize people, on the printing presses that were being used to spread those ideas, on the telegraph systems, and later on the telephones. And then for those radicals that were making an impact that they could not easily control, they just made them disappear. In addition to this pushback against radicalism, we do see conservatives in the second half of the 19th century across Europe starting to buy into this idea of nationality and nationalism. This is a real, if you can't beat them, then co-opt their movement type of move. So we have folks like the Prussian government, who was, if you remember, trying to bring the German states underneath its control. And so it started supporting scholarship and any type of propaganda that built up the idea that there is a unified German nation that they should be leading. If anybody's familiar with the Brothers Grimm, who lived at the beginning of the 19th century, all those guys were doing was they were going around the different German states and they were collecting a lot of different fairy tales in the hopes of demonstrating that they were all actually telling the same fairy tales to each other, maybe slightly differences between like Bavaria and Westphalia. So things like the stories of Little Red Riding Hood, which had different versions, or Hansel and Gretel, which had different versions all over the different German states, the Brothers Grimm were trying to demonstrate as anthropologists, as social scientists themselves, they were trying to demonstrate that there was a common German nation with common roots, and that's why they were all telling the same stories to their children and to each other. Well, this is the type of stuff that the Prussian government loves now that we get into the second half of the 19th century. They see this as their way that they're finally going to be able to gain dominance over the other German states. Similar things were happening in Italy, with the Kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia really pushing these ideals in the second half of the 19th century, that there was some type of common Italian origin. Of course, the easiest way to do that was to reach back to the Roman Empire, where the peninsula of Italy was seen as the seat of that empire, and the people there all being Roman citizens. And then, of course, there were other states that had been unified for a long time, Britain and Russia being two examples of this. But they also really ramped up the ideas of nationalism in the second half of the 19th century for the same reasons that we had talked about in the previous video. This is how you get people to much more willingly follow the leaders of their nation into war or into any other sacrifice that they're asking citizens to make, because they're not making those sacrifices for the aristocracy. They're making those sacrifices for their country. So all of this new tech and all this new nationalistic spirit that was certainly coming into the foreground after the revolutions of 1848 got its first real test run in 1852 on the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea. There's one other major country in Europe that we haven't really talked about much yet, and that's the Ottoman Empire. We're going to be looking at them more in the next unit. But the Ottoman Empire was a significant European power by the time we get to the modern period, really by the time we get to the early modern period. In 1453, they had taken the city of Constantinople. Constantinople was the capital of the old Byzantine Empire, and the Byzantine Empire was really just the continuation of the ancient Roman Empire. The Byzantines actually called themselves Romans. Though by the time we get to the 12, 13, 1400s, the Byzantine Empire was essentially just the city of Constantinople and a few surrounding lands. The Ottoman Turks had been taking away much of their European and Middle Eastern holdings. Well, in 1453, the Ottomans finished the job taking the city of Constantinople, eventually renaming it Istanbul, which is the name of that city in the modern day. And so from the 15th through the 18th centuries, Southeast Europe was totally owned by the Ottomans. This portion of Europe was mostly populated by Slavs and Greeks. These were mostly Eastern Orthodox Christians. And in the 18th century, in the 1700s, as the power of Russia was growing, it really came to see itself as the leader of Slavic peoples. Remember this connection that the Russians have to the Slavs, a group of Europeans that live in Eastern Europe, both down there in Southeast Europe and further up in places like Ukraine. The Russians themselves, being Slavic and being the only major Slavic power for a long time, would think these folks are really ours to rule. They're part of our domain. This is going to have repercussions all the way up through the Cold War of the 1950s through 1980s. By the time we get to the 19th century, though, the Ottomans were really losing power. A lot of this had to do with internal issues, which we'll be talking about in later lectures, but some of it had to do with nationalistic impulses of their European subjects who were creating issues for them in Southeast Europe. So, for example, from 1804 to 1835, we have something called the Serbian Revolution. The Serbs were another Slavic group that had been inspired by what had been happening in France. And if the French can throw out their king and develop their own nation, why couldn't the Serbs throw out their Ottoman overlords and create their own Serbian kingdom? Ultimately, in 1835, the Serbs did get quasi-independence. They were still officially part of the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottomans did allow them to run their own affairs. From 1821 to 1832, we have the Greek War of Independence, another early example of nationalism. And that ended in absolute success, with Greece being able to set up its own kingdom. And we need to remember that this is that period of the concert of Europe where all the different major powers of Europe were trying to maintain that balance of power. Well, there was a lot of concern with the Ottoman Empire seemingly collapsing in slow motion. Throughout the 1800s, you would often hear diplomats talking about what they called, quote, the Eastern Question. And the Eastern Question was what they called the sick man of Europe. The Ottoman Empire being the sick man of Europe. We do have this part of ourselves that is dying off. And as it dies off, it's going to leave a void. And who's going to fill in that void of power as the Ottomans collapse? That whole issue could totally tear apart this balance of power. I mean, what if Russia got the entire Ottoman Empire? That would make Russia way too powerful for any other state to be able to overtake them. Or what if Austria got a bit and Russia got a bit, but Prussia and France and Britain were left out? Again, the balance of power was something that really seemed to be on the edge of falling apart because of this Eastern question, because of the dying sick man of Europe. Well, in 1853, Russia moved to settle this, quote, Eastern question. They started this by placing troops in the Danubian principalities. These were not necessarily part of the Ottoman Empire, but these were countries that were vassals or had pledged their allegiance to the Ottoman Empire. So it's not exactly invading Ottoman lands, but it's essentially invading Ottoman lands. The Ottomans had only one choice. They responded by declaring war, which allowed Russia to say, like, we didn't declare war. We were just having some troops hang out over here with our friends in the Danubian provinces. But if you're going to declare war on us, I guess we got to go to war with you. And when this started, the Russians did very well against the Ottoman army. Now, there's a couple things going on here. The Ottoman army had actually peaked around 200 years beforehand. By the time we get to the 19th century, it was a mess. Anybody could have taken out the Ottomans at this point. The Russians, for their part, had a strong belief that they had one of the most powerful armies in Europe. As a matter of fact, most other Europeans also believed that the Russians had one of the most powerful armies in Europe. They put a lot of money into their military. Remember, it was the Russians who had pushed back against Napoleon, the ones that had started that turning of the tide against him. That was because of the Russians. But the Tsar of Russia at the time, the Emperor of Russia at this period, was a guy who really wanted to have a good-looking army, but didn't necessarily pay a lot of attention into the nuts and bolts of running his army. And so, quite famously, they had cavalry units that were outstanding at parade. Very well dressed, their horses could do cool tricks, but they had virtually no combat training. All the Russian soldiers had really well-polished boots, but they didn't really know how to fight in an actual war. In other words, the power of the Russian military was all a mirage, though nobody knew it yet, including the Russians. I mean, they're kicking the butt of the Ottomans. Of course they should be, because they have the most awesome military in the world, supposedly. Well, you can imagine, this makes places like Britain and France very nervous. This powerful Russian army is going to take over the Ottoman Empire, which is going to make them even more powerful, and nobody's going to be able to stop them after that. So in 1854, France and Britain declared war on Russia. That year, they invaded the Crimea, which was really the source of Russian power in the Black Sea. Again, the Crimea being this peninsula up here at the top of the Black Sea. That next year in 1855, the rising Italian power of Piedmont Sardinia also joined in with the British and the French to help out the Ottomans. They weren't going to let some other nations just take all that fame and glory for themselves, and they are trying to build up their own nation. They wanted a chance to get in there and show how well they could fight too. And this is when everybody found out that the Russian army sucked. All of a sudden, you have British and French and Sardinian troops who just walk all over these totally underprepared Russian units. But even with that easy dominance of the Russians, the war in Crimea was hell. There was a little over 1.1 million casualties with around 600,000 dead. Most of these, though, didn't come from combat. Almost all of these troops that died from hunger and disease. France and Britain weren't really able to supply their troops very well. There were significant hygienic issues in the camps and in the hospitals. This is the war that a woman that you might have heard of got her first taste of action. Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale is really the creator of modern nursing. And Florence Nightingale noticed something as she was trying to assist these doctors that were in all these field hospitals with the military. She noticed that doctors who washed their hands before they operated on wounded soldiers, those soldiers didn't get infected as often as those that had been operated on by doctors who just went from one soldier to the next, putting his bloody hands from one soldier into another. She's really the first one that starts advocating for maybe doctors should wash their hands before they put them in somebody else's body. And you can imagine she got a lot of pushback for being a silly woman at the time with these silly ideas. Germ theory had not been articulated yet. There was no broad understanding that diseases were caused by microbes. But Nightingale was a true pioneer and significantly changed the practice of Western medicine in the long term because of her service during the Crimean War. It's during this war that siege tactics really became the norm. The use of trenches became standard. This is going to become a much larger issue by the time we get to World War I. But World War I wasn't the first time that trenches were ever used. It's just that by the time we get to World War I, trenches were not easily overcome. We'll come back to that later. Just be aware that trench warfare in many ways starts during this Crimean War and will continue on in wars like the American Civil War. And of course, many of these new technologies were really changing the game. This is the first war we have that rifled muskets were regularly used. So a war where you could actually aim and shoot at somebody. The old school muskets, the reason why people had to always shoot at the same time was it was more like a shotgun. It wasn't going to be able to get a really accurate shot. By the time we get to the 1850s, we actually have rifled out muskets that make the bullets spin so that when somebody shoots, it essentially travels in a straight line, making it possible to have sharpshooters and snipers. This is also the first war that we have extensive use of the telegraph. What this means, of course, is that military generals could be making calls about the war, could be setting up strategy without ever even having to go to the front. Heck, not even ever having to go to the war zone itself. You could be a general hanging out back in Paris, giving some type of commands to your colonels over in the Crimea. That's not a good way to run a war, especially a war where technology has changed things so quickly that the generals of their day did not have any experience with this new type of warfare. This is also the first war that we have submarine mines made. That's not necessarily the use of submarines, but actual mines in the water that would blow up ships that were doing things like transporting troops to the front. And this is also the first war that we have photography and war journalism. So we actually have lots of images from the Crimean War. The most famous one being this right here, the Valley of the Shadow of Death. And now you also have reporters that can be on the front lines watching things unfold as they happen and then telegraph that story back home for their editors to put in the paper. So you now have civilian populations that can follow wars at the blow-by-blow level. This also helps to create nationalism, where people are now following on a daily basis what their sons and brothers and husbands and fathers were doing out on the front. It made people feel like they were all in it together. And of course, anybody that's familiar with our own Civil War here in the United States that lasted from 1861 to 1865, the Crimean War really was a foreshadowing of what would end up happening here in the United States. Well, like I said, Russia was much weaker than anybody had expected. In 1856, Russia signed the Treaty of Paris. The Ottoman Empire survived, but only because other European powers didn't want Russia to take it. That being said, almost all players in this war took a beating. It was clear that the Ottoman Empire was on its last legs. Russia thought it had an awesome military, but it turns out that they had not been keeping up. As a matter of fact, this really caused some changes in Russia. The Tsar of Russia in 1861 decided he really needed to revamp his entire country if he's going to catch up with these powers that had just defeated him. So in 1861, he freed all of the serfs. Russia was one of the last places in the West, in Europe, that still had serfs. And of course, the hope was that these folks could then move to the cities, they could go ahead and find work within factories, and Russia could finally have its own industrial revolution, something that had not really taken place there yet. We won't get deep into it, but this didn't work out as well as expected. What really ended up happening is you freed all these serfs, but these serfs didn't have land, they didn't have money, they didn't have an education, they had no way to get to the city, and so many of them still end up being underneath the power of landlords. In many ways, it caused a lot of social chaos in Russia with no real payoff, at least not in the short term. This same Tsar that was ruling in 1861, Alexander II, he even started playing with the idea of having some type of a parliament, or in Russia what they called a Duma, that could bring in the support of the middle class to help run his government and feel like they had a voice in his government. Ultimately, though, he's going to end up getting assassinated, and his son, Alexander III, was an absolute reactionary. And so whatever progress had started underneath Alexander II had encouraged a lot of Russian intellectuals, middle-class folk, to dream of a future. That was all rolled back underneath his son. And all that ended up doing was taking liberal-minded people and pushing them in radical directions. We're not that far away from the Russian Revolution, from the Communist Revolution in Russia of 1917. Austria, for its part, had actually stayed out of the war. It had decided it didn't want to get involved. And that type of neutrality almost sounds noble, but remember, Austria was part of the Holy Alliance with Prussia and Russia, and when Russia was like, hey, Austria, get in on this, we need your help. Remember, their initial troop placement was in those Danubian principalities that were right next to Austria, and when Austria did not follow through, the relationship between Russia and Austria soured. Remember this, because by the time we get to World War I, Russia and Austria, two countries that for many, many decades had been on the same side of things, will find themselves in war against each other. That comes from the Austrians betraying, or at least from the Russian mindset, betraying the Russians during the Crimean War. Of course, France and Britain and Russia lost tons of soldiers during this war. Piedmont Sardinia actually did pretty well because they knew how to keep their soldiers supplied. A lot of it had to do with the fact that they had good navies and they weren't as far away from the action. But even Britain ended up losing some prestige. Britain, which had the largest empire in the world, which had the most powerful navy in the world, still was not able to take care of its troops during the Crimean War, putting a little bit of a dent in its very shiny image of the time. Now, once this Crimean War was done, smart leaders were able to start putting the concert of Europe back together, though it was clearly more shaky because of the issues of the Ottoman Empire, because of that Eastern question. And it's going to get even a little more shaky when new nations are created in the 1870s. We'll be getting into the creation of Germany and Italy in more detail later on, but we're just going to go over the basics of how these two countries were made right now. In 1862, this man, Otto von Bismarck, became the minister-president of Prussia. Essentially, he was the prime minister for the king. The king of Prussia at that time, Wilhelm I, was really struggling with his diet, with the Prussian diet. They were a bunch of folks that were just too liberal for his taste. They were wanting to spread too many liberties to too many people. And he was really looking for a minister-president who would back his conservative values, make sure that Wilhelm I had his monarchical powers protected. Bismarck was that guy. Bismarck, though, in addition to being a monarchist, was also a nationalist. He really wanted to finish that job of having the German people united underneath Prussia, not Austria. Remember, this goes all the way back to the struggles between Prussia and Austria in the 1700s over the Holy Roman Empire. As a matter of fact, in 1866, this struggle for control came to a head in a war between Prussia and Austria. Prussia ended up winning. And in 1867, they got most of the northern German states to join in a confederation with them, something called the North German Confederation. So you can see here on this map, Prussia, with the subservient other German states in the north, is getting pretty close to unified Germany. It still did not have those southern states, the one in here that are in yellow. Then in 1870, Prussia went to war with France. 1870 to 1871 was the Franco-Prussian War. Remember, this was the French Empire underneath Napoleon III. Though the war was concluded when Napoleon was actually captured by German forces. And with the conclusion of this war, Bismarck was able to annex the remaining German states, and he took a chunk of France, Alsace-Lorraine. Remember this Alsace-Lorraine. It is a region of Europe that has tons of coal deposits during this Industrial Revolution. In other words, it's a very valuable piece of land, and Germany taking it away from France in 1871 is something they're going to remember all the way up until World War I, the conclusion of World War I in 1917. Alsace-Lorraine is going to be this football between the two countries that will create an impetus for future wars. With the taking of these southern states and with the taking of Alsace-Lorraine in 1871, King Wilhelm I proclaim the German Empire, taking on the title of Kaiser Wilhelm. Kaiser is just the German pronunciation of Caesar. And so he was claiming to be kind of like a Roman emperor of the German Empire. And Otto von Bismarck was given the title of Chancellor of the Empire. Over in Italy, the peninsula was made up of all these small states, and these small states throughout the late Middle Ages and the early modern period were always at the mercy of surrounding states like France, Spain, Austria, and others. There were some in Italy who did have a dream of a united, powerful nation state, but the process of getting everybody in Italy on board with that was much more complicated than how the Germans had been already developing a national identity even before they created a state. So I'm just going to go over some of the major signposts without getting into the nuts and bolts of all of it. In 1859, Napoleon III of France allied with Piedmont Sardinia against Austria. This coalition ended up winning, which allowed Piedmont Sardinia to annex parts of northern Italy, this area on the map that you see called Lombardy. This is something that had been given to Austria during the Treaty of Vienna. Then in 1860, a guy named Giuseppe Garibaldi led a revolt in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. The kings were thrown out, and there was a kingdom-wide vote, one of those plebiscites, that was held in 1860, asking if the people of the old Kingdom of the Two Sicilies wanted to join Piedmont Sardinia. This passed. So in 1861, the Kingdom of Italy was proclaimed by Victor Emmanuel II, the old king of Piedmont Sardinia. Though modern Italy at this point still wasn't quite yet unified, there was still a few more pieces to go. In 1866, Italy joined up with Prussia to help defeat the Austrians. Remember the war that led to the North German Confederation. And since Italy and Prussia had defeated Austria, Austria ended up having to give Venetia to the Kingdom of Italy. Almost there, just one more part to go, Rome. Now at this point, the Pope was still holding on to his papal states, but the Pope really relied on French protection. He didn't have a very large military on his own. And as we've already talked about, in 1870, the Franco-Prussian War started. With the beginning of that war, Napoleon III, the Emperor of France, decided that he needed to pull his troops out of the papal states, out of Rome, because he needed them for his own war. Of course, once those troops were gone, Rome was a sitting duck. King Victor Emmanuel II sent in his troops, and the Pope quickly surrendered. This allowed the king then to take over Rome and actually proclaim Rome as his capital, bringing again this old idea of the Roman Empire. The Pope lost his autonomy. He is going to get it back if you're familiar with the fact that the Vatican is actually its own country in the modern day. That's going to be a gift to the Pope from a later Italian dictator, a guy named Benito Mussolini. We'll come back to that later on. But one of the things that you really need to be keeping in mind here is that the creation of Italy and Germany, not only do we have two different nationalisms that are being articulated, but they are kind of working together. At least a couple territories that were added to the Italian kingdom were added as the result of other wars that Prussia was fighting. Whether it was Italy joining up with Prussia and getting Venetia after Austria is defeated, or Prussia fighting France, France pulling out troops so that it was easier for Italy to take over Rome. And of course, these two countries, Germany and Italy, are still going to have some partnerships in their future. The creation of these two new large nation states once again threatened the balance of power. Now, Otto von Bismarck, the dude that really was the architect of creating the German Empire and tangentially helped create the Kingdom of Italy, Bismarck didn't want to just destroy the old game. He wanted to be part of that game. But there was one thing that he really wanted to change. By the time Italy and Germany were created, Spain, Portugal, France, Britain, and the Netherlands had already colonized most of the world. Essentially, the only place really left was the interior of Africa. Now, for a long time, tropical diseases within Africa stopped Europeans from conquering that region. They had plenty of forts all along the coast of Africa. Of course, these were the forts where they had traded for things like slaves. But anytime Europeans actually tried to go into the interior of Africa, tried to explore inwards, they were usually killed by diseases like malaria, diseases that they had no natural immunity to. But in the second half of the 19th century, medicine had advanced enough to actually give them some immunity. A substance called quinine. that actually made it possible to survive malaria or hopefully not catch malaria at all, was a huge player in this. And it should be noted that quinine was added to soda water to create something called tonic water. And a lot of the European folk that were able to actually explore the interior of Africa and later on conquer the interior of Africa did so because they drank plenty of gin and tonics. Even in the modern day, tonic water still has quinine in it. And because of these new explorations, because of these new possibilities of conquest, it looked like Europe might actually end up in some colonial wars again. Bismarck, for his own part, thought that there was a better way to actually carve up Africa between the different European powers. He's a civilized guy that doesn't want to have to get into all of this bloody war between Europeans. And he had in his mind that there could be a rational way to steal all of that land from the people living in Africa. So in 1884, he called for a conference. This Conference of Berlin lasted from 1884 to 1885, and European diplomats meeting in Berlin carved up Africa between themselves, essentially set out lines, areas where Germany could invade or France could invade, and then they also set out rules for how they would make their claims. Rules like you have to plant your flag there, that you have to maintain some type of outpost within a given region. The whole idea was this is how we will recognize the sovereignty of different European nations over these lands. If you're familiar with a comedian named Eddie Izzard, he has a pretty good joke about Europeans going out and conquering the world with their flags, and every time they would take a place and plant their flag, locals would be like, but this is our land, to which Europeans could just respond, well, do you have a flag? It's a joke, but it's kind of an accurate one, particularly when it comes to Africa. It should also be noted that this new use of flags everywhere was heavily tied to nationalism. And I want to emphasize that the Berlin Conference is really the primary source of Africa's modern difficulties. It's not the only thing that has hurt the African continent and all the various African peoples in the modern day, but it's probably the most detrimental thing that still echoes in modern day Africa. We'll be coming back to that later, but you have to remember the Berlin Conference. But this Berlin Conference really was the final European-wide cooperation of that concert of Europe. And a lot of it had to do with a new system of alliances that were starting to pop up. 2 years before that Berlin Conference, in 1882, Bismarck had negotiated something called the Triple Alliance, a defensive alliance between Germany, Austria, and Italy. Essentially an alliance that said if one of us is attacked, all of us are attacked. And that in itself is not necessarily problematic. But now you have a central group of powers that are working together, not necessarily with everybody else. That very quickly throws out of whack the balance of power. And indeed, this concern over this new central alliance, this triple alliance, it led to many other European powers creating alliances of their own to counter this Central European bloc. In 1894, we get the Franco-Russian alliance between France and Russia, of course, the two major countries surrounding the Central European bloc. In 1904, we get the Entente Cordiale between Britain and France. This was essentially a gentleman's agreement to help each other out in times of need. And in 1907, we get the Anglo-Russian Entente. This system of alliances between these three countries, Britain, France, and Russia, came to be called the Triple Entente. And if you know anything about World War I, it's essentially going to be a war between the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance, minus Italy eventually. We'll get to it. Now, in the early 1900s, there were a couple crises that popped up when Germany wanted to claim Morocco for its own. France wasn't happy with this at all. France controlled the country right next to Morocco, Algeria, and France was planning on having some type of influence over Morocco. Now, this is the type of thing that European powers have been able to work out between themselves so many times throughout the 19th century after the reign of Napoleon. But because of this new Triple Entente versus Triple Alliance dynamic, there was no consensus that anybody was able to build. There was also growing tensions as Germany seemed to be positioning itself to take advantage of the Ottomans as their empire was collapsing. And so a lot of these major European countries, particularly of the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia, were getting very worried about Germany upsetting the balance of power. That is, Germany becoming a power equal to them. And all of this tension that had been building up for a couple decades blew up when one assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand of Austria led to all 6 of these countries declaring war on each other in 1914. This, of course, is the start of World War I. And this war was not just between these 6 countries. It was between these 6 countries and their empires, bringing in soldiers from India and Africa, fighting over colonies over in the Pacific Ocean, and spheres of influence in China. They're even able to end up bringing in other countries that didn't necessarily have a dog in the fight originally, countries like the United States. World War I is the cataclysmic repercussion of all these dominoes that had first been set off by the formation of nationalist ideas in the French Revolution being spread across Europe by Napoleon Bonaparte. In the modern day, when we want to talk about power-hungry, dangerous people, we refer to Adolf Hitler quite often. Well, before Hitler, Europeans referred to Napoleon, and he was on a lot of people's mind when this great war of World War I started off.